Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Andre and on today's video we are going to be talking about the magnificent festivities of the marriage between Isabel of Braganza and Prince Eduardo of Portugal. They took place in 1537 and they are described as the most magnificent festivities that Portugal had ever seen until that point. Everything was organized and paid for by the family of the bride, the House of Braganza. We know quite a lot of details about these festivities because a group of texts that described it managed to survive. But this is not merely just a festivity to celebrate a new couple. It's a political statement by the House of Braganza. With these festivities, what we are witnessing is an aristocratic house flexing its muscles in front of the entire court and the king. So who were Isabel of Braganza and Eduardo of Portugal? Let's start with the bride. Isabel of Braganza was the eldest daughter of the 4th Duke of Braganza. The Portuguese historian Mafalda Soares da Cunha dedicated a substantial part of her academic research to the study of the history of the House of Braganza, so I'm going to follow her studies for this part. The House of Braganza had its origins in two figures. One was Nuno Alvares Pereira, and the other one was King João I of Portugal in the beginning of the 15th century. Nuno Alvares Pereira is one of the most celebrated figures in Portuguese history, and he reached a status of national hero. Nuno Alvares Pereira was born in 1360. His father was Álvaro Gonçalves Pereira, and he was the master of the Portuguese branch of the Hospitallers. He was a figure of great influence in both the Portuguese and the Castilian courts in the 14th century, and apparently he had more than 30 children, by different women, of course. From a very young age, Nuno Alvares Pereira displayed a very strong religious fervor, articulated with ideals of chivalry. Galahad, the perfect knight, was his model. And part of the perfection of Galahad came from the fact that he was pure. And this is something that Nuno Alvares Pereira, in his youth, tried to emulate. Apparently, he had a very hard time accepting that he had to marry. Mafalda Soares da Cunha also points to the fact that his marriage was arranged when he was at a very young age, and also, and most importantly, that his marriage was arranged to a widow. The position of a widow in the marital market in the medieval period was seen as less valuable. But whether he liked it or not, he ended up actually marrying. On the other side, the wife of Nuno Alvares Pereira, Leonor Alvim, was a very wealthy widow. And this wealth is the origins, it's the first step of the fabulous wealth that the Braganzas accumulated over the centuries. Nuno Alvares Pereira had a brilliant military career. Anyone that is interested in medieval military history has to know about Nuno Alvares Pereira because he was one of the great generals of that time. This is a period of great convulsions. I'm not going to go into great detail. I will just only explain to you in a very simple way. So when King Fernando of Portugal died, he had no male heirs. He only had one legitimate daughter, and that daughter, Beatriz, was married to the King of Castile. Through his wife, the King of Castile wanted to gain control of the Kingdom of Portugal. And this divided Portuguese society. On one side, you have those that supported the Castilian cause, and on the other one, you had those that supported the Portuguese cause. Amongst this turmoil, the figure of João, the master of the Order of Avis, appeared as a possible candidate to the Portuguese throne. So João was the illegitimate son of King Pedro of Portugal, so he was an illegitimate half-brother of King Fernando. In the spring of 1385, in the city of Coimbra, João was proclaimed King of Portugal, and he was the first member of the second dynasty, the House of Avis. But nothing was guaranteed yet because the King of Castile entered Portugal with an army, and the Portuguese and the Castilian armies met in what nowadays we call the Battle of Aljubarrota. The outcome of this battle was a huge defeat of the Castilian army. The Portuguese were victorious, and the leader of the Portuguese army, the general of that army, who was also the constable of Portugal during that time, was Nuno Alvares Pereira, and this covered him with glory. To repay his good services, the new king gave Nuno Alvares Pereira vast extensions of land, something that he will later regret, and he also gave him the title of Count of Arraiolos, Barcelos, and Ourém. So besides having this brilliant military career, Nuno Alvares Pereira, as I said before, is someone that was deeply religious and had a very strong chivalric moral. Later in his life, he decided to follow a life in the church. And when he died, he already had this sort of aura of sanctity around him. And that sanctity was confirmed in 2009 when Nuno Alves Pereira was made a saint by the Catholic Church. From his marriage with Leonor Alvim, Nuno Alves Pereira only had one surviving daughter, Beatriz, and she became the heiress of her father's immense fortune. When it came to wealth, Nuno Alves Pereira was practically a rival of the king himself, and this is something that João I was not particularly happy about. I did refer before that the king regretted giving so much, so he tried to correct the situation. So one of the strategies of the king was a marriage between Beatriz Pereira, the daughter of Nuno Alves Pereira, and the king's eldest son, Duarte, who would later become King Duarte I of Portugal. You might say, well, this is jackpot. Nuno Alves Pereira would be now the father of the future Queen of Portugal, so of course he said yes. Wrong. He did not agree with this wedding. He said no. And you're probably wondering why? Why did he say no? Wouldn't he want his daughter to become queen? That would be a great privilege. Well, Nuno Alves Pereira was a very intelligent man, and he saw this proposition exactly for what it was, a plan of the king. Why? Because if Beatriz became Queen of Portugal, she would still be the heiress of her father. She would still inherit his house and his lineage. But all of that house that he created and that he worked so hard to build would be extinguished because it would be absorbed by the crown. It would be absorbed by the royal household. And this is not something that Nuno Alves Pereira was looking for. So another marriage was proposed between Beatriz and Afonso, an illegitimate son of João of Portugal. So before João became King João I of Portugal and before he married Philipa of Lencaster, he had a relationship with a lady called Inês Pires. And from that relationship, two children were born, Afonso and Beatriz. Beatriz would later be married in England and she would become Countess of Arundel. Afonso would marry Beatriz Pereira and many decades later would be given the title of Duke of Braganza. So long story short, the House of Braganza descends on one side from Nuno Alves Pereira and from the other one from King João I of Portugal. Nuno Alves Pereira was the venerable figure, the ideal Christian knight, and King João I was, well, he was royalty. To quote Mafalda Soares da Cunha, crown and church. That was the official and definitive consecration that the Braganzas capitalized on abundantly. So in a way, this is almost like the marketing of the House of Braganza. So from one side, they point to, we descend from Nuno Alves Pereira, this sort of holy, perfect hero figure. And on the other one, we descend from royalty. In the beginning of the 16th century, the House of Braganza positions itself in a very clear way as the most powerful and the wealthiest family in the kingdom right after the royal family. A great example of this is the motto of the fourth Duke of Braganza, the father of Isabel the bride, which was Depois de vós, nós, which means after you, and when they say you, they're referring to the king, us, the Braganzas. So now let's go back to the bride. In her 2019 master's dissertation, the Portuguese historian Andrea Louro presents one of the most complete biographies of Isabella of Braganza. So, as I said, Isabella of Braganza was the daughter of the fourth Duke of Braganza, Jaime, and his first wife, Leonor of Guzmão. Therefore, she was also the sister of Teodósio, the future fifth Duke of Braganza. It's not clear today to historians when was Isabel born, but most likely it was a little bit before 1512. 1512 was a pivotal year in the history of Isabel because an event took place that year that would change her life forever. Her mother, the Duchess of Braganza, was assassinated by her father, Jaime. The Duke accused his wife of committing adultery with a man called António Alcoforado. Both the Duchess and this young nobleman were executed by the Duke, although nowadays it's not clear if the adultery actually existed or if this was just a strategy by the Duke of Braganza to get rid of his wife. Years later, Jaime remarried. He married Joana of Mendonça, who was much younger than he was. She was a Portuguese aristocrat. She came from the mid Portuguese aristocracy, and she had previously been a lady-in-waiting to the third wife of King Manuel I of Portugal, Leonor of Austria. This was not a wedding that brought great prestige or wealth to the House of Braganza. The Duke himself tells us why. He married her for the contentment he had of her. In other words, he married her simply because he liked her. We don't know much about the life of Isabel until her marriage, which is something completely normal since she was a woman. She was raised by her paternal grandmother, Isabel, that's where her name comes from, and also by her stepmother, Joana of Mendonça. She must have had a very good education because later in her life she would reveal herself as a very erudite and cultivated person. That education for sure was inside the models, the traditional models of the education of a young aristocratic woman in the Renaissance. We can also not forget that the court of her father and later of her brother was a great center of diffusion of the culture of the humanism of the Renaissance. And Isabel had a very close contact with figures like Cataldo Siculo, who was an Italian humanist that worked in Portugal, or for instance Diego Sigeo and his daughters Luisa and Angela. Luisa is particularly famous because she was a polyglot. She spoke 9 languages perfectly. The Dukes of Braganza, besides being extremely wealthy, were great patrons of the arts. The environment in which Isabel grew up was a modern, cultivated, and refined environment. Physically, Isabel was described as being blonde with green eyes. There are 2 portraits that depict her. These 2 paintings are the most significant portraits that we have of her. Unfortunately, they date from a period in her life when she was already a mature woman. We don't have images of her in her youth. So this first painting is known as the Dama del Joyel, the Lady of the Jewel, and it's nowadays housed in the Prado Museum in Madrid. It dates from the middle of the 16th century, and many historians like Anne-Marie Jordan identified this portrait as being a portrait of Isabel of Braganza. We can see how sumptuously dressed she is, although it is quite somber, because this painting was made when she was already a widow, so she is presenting herself as a respectable yet still fashionable widow. This second painting it's a miniature, and it's attributed to the Portuguese painter Francisco de Holanda, and is nowadays housed in the Galleria Nazionale di Parma in Italy. It's part of a larger group of miniatures that depict members of the House of Farnese and the House of Vichy, and they were taken to Italy by Isabel's eldest daughter, Maria, who married Alessandro Farnese in 1565. In this portrait, we can see Isabel dressed as what nowadays we would understand as a nun. Well, she's not dressed as a nun. She never became a nun. She's dressed as a widow. This is how a respectable widow of the Renaissance would dress. So now that we know the bride, let's talk about the groom. So who was Duarte of Portugal? So Duarte was born in 1515, and he was the 9th son of King Manuel I of Portugal and his second wife, Maria of Castile and Aragon. Duarte he's not a very well-known figure in Portuguese history for 2 reasons. One of them is that he was the youngest son, so nothing great was expected normally from those who were younger, and because he also died very young, so he had no time to have an actual impact in history. We know little about his childhood, but he had a normal childhood. In the beginning, he was probably raised by women, and then around 7 or 8 years, he was given to men for him to be educated in all of these sort of masculine, virile activities that was expected of a Renaissance prince. We do know that he was a very cultivated man. Pedro Nunes, the Portuguese mathematician, was his teacher, as well as Gaspar Moreira, who taught him Latin, grammar, and poetry. But his most famous teacher was the Dominican priest André de Rezende, who was a very well-known Portuguese humanist. Although we don't know much about his childhood, we do have some small anecdotes. So, for instance, one day he pretended that he was sick so that he could skip his Latin class. So he also had a naughty side to him. We know that he liked to hunt. For instance, we do have accounts that sometimes he would even spend the night in the forest or in the fields, fully dressed, sleeping under a tree. We cannot forget that hunting during this time period was considered a virile activity and something very important for a Renaissance prince and for a Renaissance noble, because it was a way for them to practice for war. Not only would they be in shape, which is something that was necessary, but it would also help create bonds of brotherhood with the other men. So when on a battlefield, those ties and that experience would come out very handy. He was also a very religious person, someone who had a very strong religious belief. And like his brothers Afonso and Enrique, he was also originally destined to have a career in the church. André de Rezende, his teacher, describes him as a man that had fair skin, brown hair, a strong beard. He was not very tall and not very short. He was sort of in the middle, and he probably had a more of an athletic, robust build. So, what were the origins of the marriage between Isabel and Duarte? Well, apparently the idea came from the king, and this took the Duke of Braganza by surprise. This was not the first time, it would certainly not be the last time, that a member of the House of Braganza would marry into the royal family. To better understand this marriage, it's necessary to understand the marital strategies of the House of Braganza. Once again, the Portuguese historian Mafalda Soares da Cunha is the best source of information for this field. So, during the 15th century, the marital strategy of the House of Braganza was to create a family network with the most important aristocratic families in the kingdom, and when possible, with the royal family itself. The goal was to create a sort of family network that would strengthen and consolidate their position in society. The families that the Braganzas married during this time period were the Noronha, Menezes, Castro, Cunha, Souza, Melo, the royal family, and inside the House of Braganza itself. During this time, almost all the members of the family would get married. And this is something that actually was the contrary of what was going on in other aristocratic families during that time period, where the younger members, the younger sons, were being pushed into celibacy. When we get to the 16th century, the strategy changes. The number of marriages of the Braganzas diminished abruptly. During this time, the House of Braganza was trying to distance itself from the rest of the Portuguese aristocracy, and they would prefer to marry inside of the family. They could also marry with the other great families of Castile, their equals, or within the royal family. An example of a marriage between the House of Braganza and one of the great families of Castile is the marriage of the parents of Isabel. So Jaime married Leonor of Guzmão, who was the daughter of the Duke of Medina Sidonia, and the Dukes of Medina Sidonia were the wealthiest family in the Iberian Peninsula. The marriages with the royal family, on the other hand, they brought prestige, but they came at a very high price. So, in the 15th century, they were trying to consolidate their position. In the 16th century, they are trying to distance themselves from the rest of the Portuguese aristocracy. So, remember the after you, us, that's exactly what they are promoting with these marriages. The Braganzas want to place themselves, and they were the second most important family in the kingdom right after the royal family. In Portugal, their biggest rivals and competitors was the House of Lencastre. The House of Lencaster descends from Jorge of Lencastre, who was an illegitimate son of King João II of Portugal. Although his father tried to make him his heir, because King João II, when he died, his son died before him, so he had no male heirs when he died, and he tried to make his illegitimate son Jorge his heir. Well, he failed to do that. King Manuel, his cousin, became king, but he made his son the Duke of Coimbra, and he was also made the Grand Master of the Orders of Aviz and Santiago. King Manuel always had a very interesting relationship with Jorge. It was, I would call it a cordial control. So the king never went against Jorge. So the king liked to have him at court, because at court he could keep an eye on what he was doing. The Portuguese historian Ana Isabel points to the fact that King João III, the son of King Manuel, always manifested a certain coldness towards the house of Lencaster, especially to Jorge, the Duke of Coimbra, and his eldest son, João the Marquis of Torres Novas, and the future Duke of Aveiro. In the 16th century, we could see the House of Braganza and the House of Lencaster competing amongst each other when it came to precedence at court. So the marriage negotiations for Isabel and Duarte begin in 1530. A very prominent figure in these negotiations was António de Ataíde, the Count of Castanheira. This is a very interesting figure. He grew up with King João III since they were young boys, so we can almost say that he was his best friend. And he was someone that had a lot of influence with the king. And this granted him a lot of enemies at court. Probably his biggest rival was the Queen Caterina of Austria. They were rivals because the Queen wanted to have that influence, and in the end she did manage to have a great deal of influence over her husband, but she saw the Count of Castanheira as her competitor. She also did not like him because when a little bit after she arrived in Portugal, she heard a rumor that it was the Count of Castanheira, António de Ataíde, that took care of the businesses related to ladies when he came to the king, at least when he was unmarried. Even though we don't have any record of the king having a mistress or illegitimate children after his marriage. He did have an illegitimate son called Duarte, but that was before he married Caterina. The Emperor Charles V, that was very much aware of the prominent position of the Duke of Braganza, tried to bring that house to his influence. So Charles V was very much interested that Isabel would marry one of the great families of Castile. So is this one of the reasons why the proposal came from the king? Was he trying to pull the Braganzas away from the influence of Castile? In her master dissertation, Andrea Louro points to the fact that João III was in his early 30s, and at this point he had yet not produced a male heir. So by marrying another one of his brothers, he would ensure the continuation of the family. So this might have been one of the reasons, we're not sure. But this marriage would definitely solve a very important issue. It would give the brother of the king a house without costing a single penny to the crown. And on top of that, the king's goal was to take a little bit away from the wealth of the Braganzas in return for a high-status wedding. By this point, the crown was in desperate need for money. The Portuguese Empire was no longer enough to sustain the crown and the court. We cannot forget that in the previous decades, the marriages of the sisters of the king, the Empress Isabel of Portugal, and Beatriz, the Duchess of Savoy, almost bankrupt the country because of their dowries, especially the dowry of Isabel, which was monumental. The House of Braganza was with their hands tied. They couldn't say no to the king. Negotiations for this marriage lasted for many years, mostly because of the dowry. The king thought that the duke was not offering enough. The duke thought that the king was asking for too much. The relationship between João III and Jaime of Braganza, they turned sour very quickly, and the duke even tried to marry his daughter in Castile, something that the king forbade him from doing. Eventually, the king even stopped answering the letters of the duke, which became increasingly more desperate. Jaime was old and sick. He just wanted to die in peace, and this issue was preventing him from doing so. From this moment onwards, it's very clear what the king is doing. He's stalling. He's just waiting for the duke to die so that he will be able to continue the negotiations with his son, Teodosio. And this is exactly what happened because the Duke Jaime died in December of 1532. After years of negotiations, the wedding by proxy was celebrated in 1536. The wedding festivities were supposed to happen in the Christmas of that year. They were later postponed to the summer of the next year because a papal dispense was needed, because the bride and the groom, they were cousins, and that took a little bit longer than it was expected. But in the end, the king decided that the festivities should take place in April of 1537. The contract and the dowry for this marriage are very complex and with a lot of details. I'm not going to go into that, but I will just say something. This was a victory to the king because he was able to subtract the Duchy of Guimarães from the House of Braganza. And we have to know that the Duchy of Guimarães was one of the main sources of income for the family, so this was a big toll on the House of Braganza. The title of the Duchy of Guimarães, as well as the financial part that was attached to it, was given to the new couple. So now let's talk about the actual festivities. So as I said, they took place in April of 1537, and they took place in Vila Viçosa, which was the seat of power of the House of Braganza. So let's start with who was present. From the royal family, we have the king, João III, the groom, Duarte, and the brothers of the king, Luís, Afonso, and Henrique. Members of the court included João of Lencastre, the Duke of Aveiro, Pedro of Menezes, the third Marquis of Vila Real, Fernando of Noronha, Lord of Vimieiro, amongst others, and their entourage. From the Braganzas, we had Teodósio, the Duke, Isabelle, who was the bride, Joana of Mendonça, the Dowager Duchess of Braganza, and Teodósio and Isabel's stepbrothers, Joana, Jaime, and Constantino. The rest of the stepbrothers of the Duke were either not present or they are not mentioned, something which is normal because they were just little children. So now let's see who was absent. The first and most notorious absence was the Queen. Queen Catarina of Austria was not present there. The sister of the king, Maria, was also not present. The daughter of the kings, Maria Manuela, and the infant Philippe were also not present. This was most likely due to the fact that the queen, Catarina, she was late in her pregnancy. She would give birth a few months later to the future Prince João Manuel, and also because the court was at mourning, because earlier in that year, 2 of the children of the king had died. This was the most appropriate behavior for the women. The king and his brothers, they were men, so they had the responsibility to go to these festivities, to go to this wedding, because it was a very important event for the kingdom. These wedding festivities represent a major investment to the Duke of Braganza. He spared no expenses. This was a moment for ostentation. So remember before that I said that this marriage was a victory to the king? Well, this was the payback time from the Duke of Braganza because now he knew that all eyes would be on him and on his house. So he made sure that he would impress everybody and really show off the wealth and the power of the House of Braganza. So one of the most impressive investments that the Duke of Braganza did was in his palace. The interventions made by the Duke on the palace for this wedding were studied by Nuno and by Jessica Hallett, and they published an article. The article is in English. I'm going to leave the link in the description if you want to know more details about it. The construction of the palace of Vila Viçosa, the main residence of the Braganza family, had its origins in the early 16th century. Teodósio, on the other hand, the new duke, he was not very impressed with the palace of his father, and he did not like him very much. It felt that it was an outdated building. Teodósio was a prince of the Renaissance. He was a man of the humanism, so he wanted to build in a modern, classical building. So this first construction campaign really came from that necessity that the Duke had of updating his father's palace, already thinking on the marriage of his sister. Throughout the 16th century, the construction will continue and the palace will become bigger and more grandiose. So here we have a plan of the first floor of the palace as it is nowadays. I'm showing it to you so that you have a notion of how the building has changed. As I said before, throughout the 16th century, there were several campaigns that enlarged the building and also changed its interior. In some cases, in a way that it's almost impossible to understand. In 1537, the palace had approximately this shape. On the east side, we have the old part of the palace that was built by Jaime, arranged around a Gothic courtyard. On the west side, Teodósio built a new wing with a Renaissance classical language made from marble. On the date of the wedding, this new wing ended on a monumental staircase, and on the first floor of the palace, the Duke built a new set of rooms for himself. These chambers were the best and most modern ones in the palace. The Duke also built a great hall. The great hall of the palace was 24 meters long and 8 meters wide. It had 5 large windows that opened to the square in front, a magnificent marble fireplace, and quite possibly an Islamic-style ceiling made from carved wood. For you to better understand the way that the palace was organized during the wedding festivities, I'm going to show you a diagram that is based on the studies of Jessica Hallett and Nuno. So why a diagram and not a floor plan? Well, that's because some of the rooms are easy to identify. For instance, the staircase, the Great Hall, they are still there, they still exist today. But other rooms, they don't exist anymore, or they were transformed in a way that nowadays it's impossible to read. So a diagram following the descriptions that were made of the festivities in the 16th century is the closest way to understand how this palace was internally organized. So here you can see the diagram. As I said, that new wing that was built by Theodosio ended on a staircase. After the staircase, we have the Great Hall that still exists. And after that, we have the chambers of the king. The rooms occupied by the king were comprised of a wardrobe, a bedchamber, a corridor, and 3 smaller rooms that are referred to as retraites, which comes from the French retrait, to retire. So they were smaller, slightly more intimate rooms. The chambers of Duarte, the groom, were comprised of a chamber, a bedchamber, a wardrobe, and a corridor that led to a retraite. This corridor allowed Eduardo to have access to the chambers of his bride as well as the chambers of his other brothers. Henrique and Afonso, that were princes, but they were also figures of the church, they were given 3 rooms. So the bedroom of Henrique is slightly smaller than the one from Afonso because Afonso in the hierarchy of the church was above his brother, and they both share the same wardrobe. Opening over a garden, we have the chambers of Luís that were comprised by a wardrobe and a bedroom. The chambers of Isabel the bride, they open onto a garden. They were comprised of a hall, an antechamber, a bedchamber, and a wardrobe. Theodosio had 2 rooms. He had a hall and a chamber, and these are described as being the worst rooms. Then his brothers, Jaime and Constantino, they had 1 room, and that room was shared between the 2, and it functioned as their bedroom and their wardrobe. The Dowager Duchess of Braganza, Joana of Mendonça, and her children, they lived in a palatial residence that was attached to the neighboring Chagas convent. As I said, there were 2 gardens, and in front of the palace there was a very vast square. These chambers, they function as individual cells. They even had their own access to the exterior thanks to staircases, but they also communicated with each other. It's also important to refer that the way that these rooms were organized was not necessarily permanent. This was the organization that was made for the festivities. Some of these spaces were ephemeral. So now let's talk about the actual event. The king and his entourage left Évora and arrived in Vila Viçosa on the 24th of April. The court was in Évora and not in Lisbon because in 1531 there was a major earthquake in Lisbon, and part of the city was destroyed and the royal palace was quite affected. So for almost an entire decade, the court had been in Évora. The main city of the kingdom kept being Lisbon, but the court stayed in Évora. And also we cannot forget that King João III of Portugal really liked the city of Évora, which is something completely normal because Évora, it is a very beautiful city. It's like a white city on top of a hill surrounded by plains of golden fields. The Duke of Braganza left Vila Viçosa with his brothers and his vassals and all the members of his household, around 600 people on horse and countless number of people on foot to greet the king. The 2 entourages, when they met, they greet each other following the protocol of the court, and the Duke and his brothers kissed the hand of the king. The Duke greeted all the brothers of the king, but he spent a little bit of more time with Duarte because he was going to be his future brother-in-law. On the way to Vila Viçosa, the 2 entourages saw many people on the fields dancing. There was music, so there was sort of popular manifestations of joy. When they arrived in Vila Viçosa, there were artillery shots from the castle. The castle was covered with flags. The bells of the church were ringing. The whole village dressed up for the festivity. The first thing that the king and his entourage did was they went to the monastery of St. Augustine, where they were received by the local clergy and where there was mass. And the mass is described as having amazing, magnificent liturgical objects made from silver. There were carpets on the floor, so everything was quite spectacular. After that, they crossed the square into the palace, where they were received in front of the door by the Duke of Braganza, who was surrounded by heralds and vassals wearing the livery of the Duke, which was yellow and blue. The Duke himself was dressed in purple velvet with a sword and dagger made from gold. The square was absolutely bursting at the seams with people. There was music, people were dancing, so there was great joy. It's very important to mention the very large quantities of people that attended these festivities. If we follow the descriptions, we can understand that the numbers variate between 15,000 and 20,000 people that came from Portugal and also from foreign countries. So the Duke and his guests, they went up the staircase. It's very important to note that probably at this point that staircase was not yet completed. So most likely half of the structure was done, but the rest was completed in wood and in fabric. This staircase was an innovation in Portuguese domestic architecture, because until then what we had in domestic buildings was two types of staircases. You either had a single ramp staircase that was always outside and attached to a wall, or you have spiral staircases inside that were normally built in the thickness of the walls. This new staircase, it's a ceremonial staircase that is quite large. This is a Renaissance staircase, and it was unique in the country when it was built. It was the first of its type as far as we know. After they climbed the staircase, they entered the Great Hall. And here you can see an image of how the Great Hall looks like today. So the room that we see here, it's precisely the same. You can see the 5 windows, you can see the marble fireplace. The only difference is the decoration. This is not the decoration that the room had in the 16th century. The ceiling that we can see is a series of portraits of the Dukes of Braganza that was made in the 18th century. The walls were covered with tapestries. Tapestries were incredibly important in 16th century domestic interiors because they would bring warmth and color to the interior, and they would function as propaganda as well for the owners. On one of the extremities of the room, we had a dais, which is a wooden platform, a raised platform, like a series of steps that was covered with carpets from chios. Chios is how in the 16th century the Portuguese referred to the island of Chios, which is an island on the coast of modern-day Turkey. So a carpet from Chios is a Turkish carpet. This was a luxury item. It was something that had to be imported from far away, and it costed a lot of money. On top of the dais, there was a chair with gold fringe that was covered with little golden medals. It might have looked like this example from the Metropolitan Museum. Now, chairs were a symbol of power and authority, and also of social hierarchy. There was only one chair in that room, and it was meant to be used by the king. On top of the dais surrounding the chair, there were velvet and brocade cushions. Those cushions were meant to be used by the most important members of the royal family and the House of Braganza during festivities. The rest of the people, they would either stand or they would sit on the floor. The Great Hall is a space for the representation of power, and some of the most important ceremonies of the festivities took place in this room. At this point, the king and his brothers went to their chambers to rest and also to change their clothes. So as I said before, after the Great Hall, we had the chambers of the king that were comprised of a wardrobe, a bedchamber, and 3 small rooms connected by a corridor. It's not very clear if the Great Hall was part of the chambers of the king, The historian Jessica Hallett believes so, and she thinks that the colors that were used in the Great Hall and in the king's rooms that tended to have a more red kind of hue were used to give the idea of continuity. The wardrobe of the king was decorated with tapestries with stories from antiquity. It had a dossal that was made from green velvet, and along the walls it had chests covered with leather. Normally, this room functioned as the antechamber of the duke. The chamber of the king was all draped with velvety satin. There was a dais, and on top of that dais, the bed of the king. The bed was particularly luxurious. The dossal on top of the bed was made from cloth of gold and cloth of silver. A very curious detail was that the pillows of the bed, they had little buttons and to close the pillowcases, and those buttons were in the shape of a rose. They were made from gold, and in the center they had a ruby. The textiles of this bed were valued at 10 times the salary of a skilled artisan for a year. Next to the bed, the king had a chair and luxurious carpets on the floor. The three little rooms, the retraites, as I said, they were decorated with cloth of Flanders and they had carpets on the floor. The first room functioned as, nowadays we would call it almost like a bathroom. That's where the king had his chamber pot. His chamber pot was inside a wooden box, and that box was lined inside with crimson satin and outside was covered with black velvet. The second room maybe was kind of like an office. It had a table with a green velvet cloth on top of it. The third room, it was probably an area where the king could eat, because there is a reference to the existence of a table, and there was cutlery there made from silver. There was food as well, and also cups for water. The king's corridor connected his rooms with the rooms of his brother, Duarte, the groom. His bedchamber was covered with tapestries. The bed cover was made from yellow velvet, and the bed had curtains made from yellow satin. There were also 4 Castilian pillows and 4 other pillows made from silk, blue silk, that were embroidered in Roman style. Next to the bed, he also, like the king, had a chair that was made from orange velvet with gold fringe, and on the floor he had a rug from Castile. His wardrobe also had tapestries and a dossal and a chair. The rooms of the princes were decorated the same way that Duarte's rooms were decorated. The only difference was the materials and the colors used. At dusk, the king, his brothers, the duke, and all the lords present gathered in the rooms of Duarte, and they moved towards the chambers of the bride. Along the way, there were many pages holding torches and candles. So there is this idea of light. And light is a symbol of festivities, because normally during everyday life, there wasn't much light. Light was something that was expensive and hard to produce. So during these festivities, this huge quantities of light, it's really a mark, a symbol that we are celebrating something. And also the investment made by the Duke. The king was dressed in his typical black and white in Portuguese style, and he had a necklace, a magnificent necklace made from gold and rubies. Duarte was wearing white satin with a sword and a dagger of gold. Louis was wearing red. He was wearing a French-style outfit that was lined with fur. Afonso and Henrique, because they were members of the church, they were wearing ecclesiastical robes. Theodosio, the duke, he was dressed in white and purple, and his doublet was in a German style. The bride was on her antechamber waiting for them. The room is described as being decorated with tapestries that depicted ancient stories. There was a dossal and a dais, as well as carpets and velvet cushions. Isabelle was wearing a Flemish-style dress made from white satin that was lined with brocade, and she was wearing many jewels. Interestingly, Portuguese religious painting from the time represents very well Portuguese fashion. So we can kind of see the way that the styles that were used during the festivities. Next to the bride was her stepmother, Joana of Mendonça, the Dowager Duchess of Braganza, and she's described as dressed as a widow with a black twill veil that cover her head. Here we can see this is a panorama of Jerusalem. It was a gift of Maximilian I to his cousin, the Queen Leonor of Portugal, and we can see her depicted in one of the corners. She outlived her husband, King João II of Portugal, for many years, so she dressed as a widow. So the way that she's represented here is the same way that Joana of Mendonça would be dressed. Next to Joana of Mendonça was her daughter, Joana of Bragança, and she's described as wearing a Flemish-style dress. The color was pardo. Pardo is a color that was very popular during this time period. It's a little bit hard to define. I would say that it's between brown and gray, like a brownish gray. And she was also covered with jewelry. In the same room, there were also various ladies of the House of Braganza that were very richly dressed and adorned. The king picked the bride and took her by his arm, and everybody followed them to the Great Hall. So, in the Great Hall, the king, the royal family, and the Braganzas all got to the top of the dais. A marriage in the 16th century had many steps, and this ceremony that is about to take place in the Great Hall is the first step. The bride and the groom, in front of the Cardinal Afonso, gave their consent to the wedding publicly. So this is the first step. The night ended with a serão. A serão was a sort of like a ball. Very interestingly, only the men are referred to dance. So the king danced with Teodosio, and the Prince Luís danced with Jaime, the brother of the Duke. And this is the reason for this is that there weren't enough ladies in the room for them to dance with them. During this ball, the royal family and the Braganzas kept being on top of the dais. The rest of the guests, they sat on the floor alongside the walls on top of carpets. The descriptions for these festivities, they also describe a very interesting detail, which is during this night, during this ball, there were several foreign hooded men inside. We don't really know who they are, and they are not described anywhere else, but most likely they were members of Castilian aristocratic houses that lived close to the border that came in to check what was going on. It's also important not to forget that Isabel, the bride, was the daughter of one of the most important families in the Iberian Peninsula, one of the wealthiest families of Castile. On the 25th of April, the king rose from his bed late, as was his habit, and there was mass in the antechamber of Isabel, presided by the Bishop of Lamego. This was the moment of the blessing and the exchange of rings. The godfather of the wedding was King João III, and the godmother was Joana of Mendonça, the Dowager Duchess. After this mass, only the members of the royal family and the Braganzas moved to the hall of Isabel, where there was a dais with an altar on top, covered by a dossal for another mass. Isabel and Duarte sat on a bench in front, and surrounding them was the king and Joana of Mendonça, and behind them, on their knees, were the brothers of the king and the Duke Teodosio. During this mass, we know that Joana of Mendonça shared some tears of happiness, which is a symbol of the affection that she had for her stepdaughter. After this mass, there were two banquets. One was for the ladies, and it took place in the chambers of Isabel, and another one was for the men, and it took place in the Great Hall. When the banquet, that probably lasted for a few hours, ended, the Duke of Braganza announced to all the knights present for them to gather in one room of the palace where the House of Braganza kept his military equipment to equip themselves for a joust. The joust took place in the square in front of the palace, so we know that the king and Joana of Mendonça and the bride and the groom saw that the joust from the palace. They saw it from the windows of the Great Hall. And we also know that there was a platform in the square for the judges, and there was musicians as well present. So what they did was jousting with lances. The first one to go was the Duke, and his adversary was his younger brother, Jaime. The Duke, of course, won. This was, after all, his moment. This was his time to shine, and this was a way for him to promote the House of Braganza in the eyes of the entire court. The joust ended after 40 lances were broken, and after the jousting, they had bullfighting, which is very traditional of the Iberian Peninsula. On the 26th of April, the king, his brothers, and the Duke attended Mass in the church of the castle of Vila Viçosa. So on the way that they were going, and then after the Mass, when they were returning, there was artillery shots. And when they came back, they had another banquet. Before the meal, the king distributed the awards from the joust that took place the day before. So we know, for instance, that Fernão de Castro, who was an aristocrat that belonged to the House of Braganza, he was considered the best fighter, and his award was a dagger made from gold. After the meal, there was a jogo de canas that I can translate as a game of canes. So canas was a tradition, an Iberian tradition that had an Arabic influence. So it was comprised of two teams that were on a horse, and they were armed with pointy canes, and they just spent the entire game throwing the canes at each other, and they would play until exhaustion. The canas, as well as the dança mourisca, the Moorish dance, that was once again a tradition that comes from the Islamic world, they brought a certain level of exoticism to the festivities, which is something that the festivities of the Renaissance really appreciated. Interestingly, a little bit after the game started, the king ordered the game to stop, to end. We don't really know why this happened. Was he getting tired of the protagonism of the Duke of Braganza, or were the players already exhausted? We don't really know. On that night, like the nights before, there was fireworks in Vila Viçosa, and the entire village is described as being illuminated. On the 27th of April, the king woke up early, and Mass was held in the church of the monastery of St. Augustine. After that, everybody gathered in the chambers of Isabel to say their goodbyes, where they spent quite a long time doing. The king, his brothers, and their entourages, they left, but the festivities kept going until the 29th of April. Well, if you want to know more about this subject, don't forget to check the sources that I used. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you on the next one.